Can Trump actually beat Canada in the race to sell natural gas to Asia? In one sentence, not yet, because Canada's ships are already sailing, while Trump's answer is a $50 billion pipeline that does not exist yet and might never get built. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how far ahead Canada already is in this race, why Trump is throwing enormous money at catching up, and whether that catch-up plan has any realistic chance of working. Let's start with what Canada has already accomplished, because this part of the story is not a promise or a plan. It already happened. In the summer of last year, the very first shipment of liquefied natural gas left Canada's Pacific coast bound for Asia. That shipment came from a massive facility called LNG Canada, sitting in Kitimat, British Columbia, fed by a pipeline stretching 670 kilometers from the gas fields further inland. For the first time in the country's history, Canada had a way to sell its natural gas somewhere other than the United States, by ship directly across the Pacific. This matters more than it might sound like at first, because of a simple fact about how natural gas has moved for decades. Unlike oil, which can be loaded onto a tanker relatively easily almost anywhere, natural gas historically needed a pipeline to move any real distance, and pipelines only go where they were built to go. For as long as Canada has been producing natural gas at scale, nearly all of it flowed south into the United States, because that is where the pipelines already existed, and building a new export route to anywhere else took decades of political fighting, environmental review, and billions of dollars in construction. To ship natural gas across an ocean instead of through a pipeline, it has to go through an expensive, technically demanding process first. The gas gets cooled down to roughly negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to turn it into a liquid that takes up a fraction of the space it would as a gas. That liquid then gets loaded onto specially built tankers designed to keep it at that extreme temperature during the entire voyage across the Pacific, before getting warmed back into gas form once it reaches its destination. This process, called liquefaction, requires massive, expensive industrial facilities, exactly the kind of facility Canada just finished building on its Pacific coast. Canada finally pushed one of those projects through, and the timing turned out to matter enormously. Just as this new export capacity came online, Trump's tariffs were reshaping the entire trade relationship between the two countries, and energy became one of the most sensitive parts of that relationship. Suddenly, having a second customer for Canadian natural gas was not just a nice long-term diversification strategy, it became a genuinely useful piece of leverage in the middle of an active trade war. Here is why Canada's position in this specific race is stronger than people realize. British Columbia's coastline sits significantly closer to major Asian buyers, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly China, than almost any comparable location in the continental United States. Shipping time matters enormously in the LNG business, since faster delivery means lower transportation costs and more flexibility responding to demand spikes. Industry analysts specifically point to this geographic advantage as one of Canada's biggest structural strengths in competing for Asian contracts, an advantage that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with simple geography. Think about what that shipping time advantage actually means in dollar terms over the life of a long-term contract. A tanker sailing from British Columbia to Tokyo or Seoul covers the distance in roughly 8 to 10 days, while a shipment from the United States Gulf Coast, the primary export hub for American LNG, has to sail either through the Panama Canal or around South America, adding weeks to the journey and substantial additional fuel and time costs. Multiply that difference across dozens of shipments a year, over a contract that might run for 2 decades, and the savings become significant enough to actually influence which supplier a buyer chooses when prices are otherwise comparable. Canada is not stopping at just the one facility either. The country is expected to have roughly 19 million tons of annual LNG export capacity built out by the end of this decade, with additional projects that have already secured final investment decisions still under construction. If every currently planned project actually gets built, Canada's total liquefaction capacity could climb as high as 45 million tons per year by the early 2030s. That would represent an enormous transformation for a country that had essentially zero LNG export capacity just a few years ago. To put that growth in perspective, going from 0 to 45 million tons of annual capacity within roughly a decade would place Canada among the more significant LNG exporting nations on the planet. A remarkable trajectory for an industry that did not meaningfully exist in this country before this decade began. Now let's talk about how Washington is responding, because this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. For decades, a massive natural gas pipeline project in Alaska has been talked about, studied, delayed, and shelved repeatedly because the economics never quite worked. The plan involves connecting Alaska's enormous but stranded natural gas reserves on the North Slope to a new liquefaction and export terminal on the state's south central coast near a location called Nikiski. The pipeline required to make this work would need to stretch roughly 1,300 kilometers, nearly twice the length of the pipeline feeding Canada's already operating LNG Canada facility. This is not a new idea that suddenly appeared because of the current trade war either. Versions of an Alaska gas pipeline have been discussed since at least the 1970s, when the state's North Slope reserves were first identified as a massive, largely untapped resource, isolated from any market by the sheer remoteness of the terrain. Multiple administrations across multiple decades have revived interest in the project, commissioned studies, and ultimately watched it stall once the true scale of the financing challenge became clear. The gas is real. The reserves are genuinely enormous. But getting that gas from underneath Alaska's frozen North Slope to a customer anywhere in the world has proven to be one of the most persistently difficult infrastructure challenges in North American energy history. Trump has revived interest in this project specifically as a competitive answer to Canada's Head Start. And there is a genuine strategic logic behind the push, even if the execution faces serious obstacles. Analysts at major commodity research firms have noted real momentum building behind Alaska LNG for the first time in years, driven largely by exactly the dynamic we have been discussing. A recognition that Canada is establishing itself as a serious, permanent competitor for Asian natural gas contracts, and Alaska sits geographically positioned to compete for some of those same buyers. But here is where the numbers get genuinely staggering, and where the gap between ambition and reality becomes impossible to ignore. The full Alaska LNG project carries a price tag estimated between $44 and $50 billion, a figure so large that industry experts are blunt about the fact that no single private company could realistically finance it alone. Building it would require some combination of direct federal government funding and a coordinated consortium of corporate partners willing to share both the enormous cost and the enormous risk. To put that $50 billion figure in perspective, that is larger than the entire annual economic output of many countries. It would rank among the most expensive single infrastructure projects ever attempted in North America, on par with or exceeding some of the largest energy megaprojects ever completed anywhere in the world. Raising that kind of capital requires convincing banks, sovereign wealth funds, and corporate partners that the eventual returns justify an enormous upfront risk spread across a construction timeline that could easily stretch beyond a decade before the first dollar of revenue ever arrives. Think about what that financing challenge actually means in practice. Even if political will exist at the highest levels of government, actually assembling $50 billion in financing, securing the environmental approvals for a pipeline stretching across some of the most remote and ecologically sensitive terrain in North America, and physically constructing over 800 miles of pipeline through Alaska's brutal climate is not something that happens on a political timeline measured in months or even a couple of years. Construction crews working in Alaska face a working season limited by extreme winter conditions, permafrost that complicates every foot of pipeline laid, and logistical challenges simply getting equipment and workers to some of the most remote construction sites anywhere on the continent. Realistic industry estimates suggest that even under a best-case scenario, actual results from this project would not materialize until well after the current political moment driving the urgency has passed. Compare that timeline to where Canada already stands today. LNG. Canada is not a proposal, not a pending final investment decision, not a pipeline route still working through environmental review. It is a completed facility, already loading ships, already generating revenue, already building the kind of operational track record and buyer relationships that matter enormously in long-term energy contracts. In a business where buyers in Japan and South Korea are signing supply agreements that stretch 15 or 20 years into the future, being operational today while your competitor is still trying to secure financing is not a small advantage. It is close to decisive. None of this means Washington is standing still on the demand side of this equation either, and this is worth understanding clearly. Trump's tariff pressure has genuinely pushed some Asian buyers toward committing to more American natural gas purchases, partly as a way to negotiate more favorable tariff treatment on other goods. China agreed to substantially increase its purchases of American LNG starting this year, and Japan has elevated natural gas cooperation with the United States as a more prominent piece of its national energy strategy. So it would be inaccurate to say Trump's approach is producing nothing. American LNG exports overall are genuinely growing, driven partly by this exact tariff leverage dynamic. But there is an important distinction between American LNG broadly, which ships primarily from established Gulf Coast facilities that have existed for years, and Alaska LNG specifically, which remains the unbuilt, unfinanced answer to Canada's Pacific Coast advantage. Those are two very different stories, and conflating them misses the actual competitive dynamic playing out in the Pacific market specifically, where shipping time to Asia genuinely favors whoever sits closest. And right now, that is Canada, not the Gulf Coast, and not yet Alaska. There is also a broader market dynamic worth understanding before we get to where this actually goes. The global LNG market itself is entering a period analysts are calling a potential glut, with worldwide export capacity expected to grow by more than 7% this year alone, as multiple new projects around the world come online simultaneously, not just in Canada and the United States, but globally. More supply chasing the same pool of buyers tends to push prices downward, which actually makes the economics of an enormously expensive new project like Alaska LNG even more challenging to justify financially, since it would be entering a market with softer prices than existed when the project was originally conceived decades ago. This glut dynamic actually creates a fascinating strategic tension worth pausing on. A market flooded with new supply from multiple countries simultaneously tends to reward whoever got there first and locked in buyers before prices softened, while punishing whoever arrives late to an already crowded market. Canada, having already begun shipping and already signing long-term contracts before this broader supply wave fully materializes, is positioned on the favorable side of that timing. Alaska LNG, still years away from even breaking ground, would be entering this exact glut environment at potentially the worst possible moment, trying to sell into a market already saturated with new supply from competitors who moved faster. Let's talk about where this actually goes from here, because there are three realistic paths, and each one matters differently depending on how patient Washington is willing to be. The first scenario: Alaska LNG continues gathering political momentum and eventually secures the federal backing and corporate partnerships needed to move forward, but on a timeline stretching well into the next decade before any gas actually ships. In this scenario, Canada spends the next 10 years or more as the only serious North American competitor for Asian Pacific Coast LNG contracts, locking in long-term buyer relationships and expanding its own capacity further, making Alaska's eventual entry into the market considerably harder even once it does get built. By the time Alaska LNG could realistically begin shipping, Canada could easily have doubled or tripled its current capacity and locked in the most desirable buyers under contracts that will not expire for another decade or two beyond that. The second scenario: the financing and environmental hurdles prove too difficult, and Alaska LNG joins the long list of previous versions of this same project that got discussed, studied, and ultimately shelved once the true costs became undeniable. This has happened before with this exact project, more than once, and the fundamental economic challenges have not meaningfully changed. Only the political urgency around it has. If this scenario plays out, Canada's Pacific Coast advantage in the Asian LNG market becomes essentially uncontested for the foreseeable future, and Alaska LNG becomes once again a project remembered mainly for how many times it almost happened rather than for anything it actually delivered. The third scenario, and the one that would represent a genuine shift in this competitive landscape: Washington finds a faster, cheaper way to compete, not through Alaska specifically, but through accelerated expansion of existing Gulf Coast capacity, combined with continued tariff pressure, convincing Asian buyers to sign contracts for political reasons rather than pure geographic convenience. This scenario does not require building a single new pipeline through Alaska's wilderness. It simply requires leveraging existing infrastructure and political relationships more aggressively, which is a fundamentally easier problem to solve than the Alaska project represents. Evidence for this scenario already exists in the China and Japan purchase commitments we mentioned earlier, suggesting Washington may already be pursuing this lower cost path alongside, or even instead of, the more expensive and uncertain Alaska option. Whichever path unfolds, notice how this connects to everything else we have documented on this channel about this trade war. Oil found buyers in Asia through a new pipeline. Aluminum found buyers in Europe during a shortage. Now natural gas is following the exact same pattern, Canada building the infrastructure and relationships to reduce its dependence on a single customer, while the policy response from Washington struggles to match the speed at which Canada has already moved. There is a lesson in that repetition worth naming directly. Every single time Washington has reached for a tariff or a trade threat as leverage over Canada, Canada's response has not been to simply absorb the pressure. It has been to spend money and years building permanent infrastructure that reduces the leverage itself. A tariff can be imposed in a single presidential announcement: a pipeline, a liquefaction terminal, a 15-year supply contract with a buyer on the other side of the Pacific. None of that gets built in an announcement. It gets built through years of steady investment that keeps happening quietly, regardless of which direction the political winds happen to be blowing in any given month. Here is my honest read on where this settles. I think Alaska LNG remains more political talking point than genuine near-term competitor for years to come, given how consistently similar versions of this exact project have stalled before under far less demanding cost estimates than exist today. But I also think Canada would be foolish to treat that as a reason to slow down, since political winds in Washington can shift. And the countries that end up winning these long-term energy competitions are usually the ones who kept building, even when their competitor looked temporarily unable to catch up. The bigger pattern worth sitting with here is this. Infrastructure takes years to build, but it lasts for decades once it exists. A tariff can change with a single presidential decision, but a completed LNG terminal, a signed 20-year supply contract, a proven shipping route to Asia, none of that disappears just because political conditions shift again next year. Canada is not just winning a trade dispute with this LNG strategy, it is building something structurally permanent that will still matter long after the current administration and its tariff policies are a memory. Future administrations, future trade negotiations, future disputes entirely unrelated to today's headlines will all take place against the backdrop of infrastructure decisions being made right now on both sides of this border, decisions that are far harder to undo than any tariff ever was. So here is the question I want you to sit with. If Washington is willing to spend $50 billion chasing a head start Canada already has, does that tell you Canada made a smarter long-term bet than most people currently realize? Or is Alaska's enormous scale simply the kind of project that eventually overwhelms any temporary advantage a smaller competitor holds? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me whether you think Alaska LNG actually gets built in your lifetime. If breaking down these long-term infrastructure competitions, the ones that will matter for decades rather than just this news cycle, is useful to you, hit subscribe, because energy infrastructure is going to keep shaping this entire relationship long after the current tariff fights fade from the headlines. And if you have not seen our breakdown of how Canadian oil already made this exact same pivot toward Asia, go watch that video next, because natural gas is simply the newest chapter in a strategy Canada has been building for years now. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.